Hi, everyone, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. In today's session, we are covering chapters 11, 12, and 13 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. We're finally arriving at Hogwarts, you guys. We're finally going to begin Harry's fourth year of study at the world's, well, certainly Britain's most prestigious wizarding school. We're going to finally learn the big secret that has been foreshadowed throughout the first third of this book. And we're going to meet a pivotal character, one Alistair Mad-Eye Moody. We'll be talking about him as we move forward. In fact, I think we should probably start talking about Mad-Eye Moody. There's a great question here that has been submitted by the wonderful Angela, who pointed out to me last week that I always refer to her as the wonderful Angela because her wonderfulness is just so complete that it has now appended itself to her name. So the wonderful Angela asks, when I first read Goblet of Fire, I loved Mad-Eye Moody. Now I know his secret, and I'm fascinated to reread events with our foreknowledge and our close analysis. How spoilery will we be about Mad-Eye? Will we keep it fresh for the new readers, or re-examine events after the reveal, or will we analyze events through the foreknowledge lens, or try to do both, aka put a pin in it? I think our approach. Okay, so I've already covered a minor spoiler. There is a secret about Mad-Eye Moody. This, I don't think, is anyone's first time through Goblet of Fire, but I do, as ever, want to pay close attention to the primacy and immediacy of the text. Therefore, with regard to our approach to Mad-Eye Moody, what I really want to do is follow the narrative instruction. That is to view him in the way that the narrative suggests that we view him. We will have ample opportunity at the end of the story to kind of backfill our understanding of this character, as we will have ample opportunity at the end of the story to backfill our understanding of the Triwizard Tournament in general, but I don't necessarily want to skip ahead. And partly that is because, again, trying to do this without revealing the big spoil, just in case any of you are as yet clueless about the ultimate resolution of the Mad-Eye Moody plotline here. I suppose what I want to do is acknowledge that Mad-Eye is presenting himself as a legitimate and complete version of himself. That is to say that he is compelling, he is convincing to everyone around him. Thus, we can assume that his performance, that his appearance is fairly consistent with the Mad-Eye Moody that everyone knows. So we're going to kind of follow the narrative instruction here, follow the narrative direction here. That, I think, is our plan. I do also, before we move in, Ryan is skeptical that we're going to cover 3 chapters in one session. We are going to cover 3 chapters in one session. I don't have that many slides. How many slides do I have? 4, 10, 13 slides today, I think. And just to make things interesting, I also have a hard out. I absolutely have to stop at 3:30 here in the Central Time Zone. That's 4:30 here over there on the East Coast. So that gives us 90 minutes to cover these 3 chapters. But we're going to do it because for all that there is a great deal of foreshadowing and a great deal to our life at Hogwarts, there isn't as much substance in these chapters as there was in the previous chapters, right? We spent a long time talking about the Wizarding World Cup and the reemergence of the Death Eaters and the reemergence of the Dark Mark, because those things are incredibly significant. And now we're doing what J.K. Rowling does fairly consistently throughout the Harry Potter series, which is drawing breath, right? We're allowing the tension here to slacken just a little bit. This is the positive side of that year-long, that academic year construction that we've talked about through the first 3 books. Sometimes toward the end of the story, the plot drags a little bit because we have to fill the entire school year. This is the good version of that, where actually nothing's going to happen really with regard to the Triwizard Tournament until Halloween. So we're just looking ahead. We're foreshadowing a lot of events that are going to come. But until that happens, we're just kind of taking a breath. We're just watching Harry settle back into life at Hogwarts, though not, it should be noted, settle back into Hogwarts in the way in which we might expect. Let's actually begin with our first slide here as we move into chapter 11. Oh, what I wanted to do was welcome Laurie, who is here for her first time, and the wonderfully named Spatula McGrady joining us also for the first time. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope you have a good time here as we discuss these chapters tonight. Good. Everyone is here. Everyone is enthusiastic. Everyone is ready to go. Let's get into it with our first slide, the very beginning of chapter 11, aboard the Hogwarts Express. Let me call this slide up here. There was a definite end of the holiday's gloom in the air when Harry awoke next morning. Heavy rain was still splattering against the window as he got dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. They would change into their school robes on the Hogwarts Express. He, Ron, Fred, and George had just reached the first floor landing on their way down to breakfast when Mrs. Weasley appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking harassed. "Arthur!" she called up the staircase. "Arthur! Urgent message from the Ministry!" Harry flattened himself against the wall as Mr. Weasley came clattering past with his robes on back to front and hurtled out of sight. When Harry and the others entered the kitchen, they saw Mrs. Weasley rummaging anxiously in the drawers. "I've got a quill here somewhere!" and Mr. Weasley bending over the fire, talking to... Harry shut his eyes hard and opened them again to make sure that they were working properly. Amos Diggory's head was sitting in the middle of the flames like a large bearded egg. It was talking very fast, completely unperturbed by the sparks flying around it and the flames licking its ears. My good neighbors heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those, what do you call them, policemen. Arthur, you've got to get over here. Here, said Mrs. Weasley breathlessly, pushing a piece of parchment, a bottle of ink, and a crumpled quill into Mr. Weasley's hands. The introduction of Mad-Eye Moody is fascinating, is immediate, and speaks to this now rapidly diminishing sense of urgency associated with the events at the Quidditch World Cup, of course. Things are afoot, but Harry's passage through life, his passage through experience, the thread of his personal experience is now deviating from that primary thread of plot that has carried us through the story thus far. Now he is separated from the wildness that is happening in the rest of the wizard world and is becoming reintegrated with Hogwarts, and that is not an entirely welcome feeling. I talked a little about this at the end of last week's session, and I'm continually fascinated by it. This is not the only time in this week's reading that we're going to observe exactly this phenomenon, but Harry's response to returning to Hogwarts is not quite what we might expect it to be. The idea of an end of holidays gloom is somewhat shocking, is certainly unusual. This does not match our experience of Harry in his first 3 years at Hogwarts. He is giddy with excitement each and every year that he is returning to school, but now he is dragging his feet a little bit. There's that completely understandable, and I think to us in the Muggle world, completely recognizable sensation of, school starts tomorrow. This is the Sunday evening feeling that afflicts many of us, me included, even as adults. The sense that, tomorrow morning means back into the normal world. It means a return to expectation and a return to kind of formalized structure, a return to no longer being in charge of our own fates, in charge of our own destinies. We will no longer be free. But for Harry, that seems a surprising shift in focus, and this is going to continue as we return to Hogwarts. Yes, Becca points out Harry is finally home, so now he gets the gloom like everybody else. That, I think, is one half of this, right? Hogwarts has, for Harry previously, always been an escape. In the first 2 years, an escape from the Dursleys. Even in the third year, when he has already escaped from the Dursleys, it is an escape from insecurity. Excuse me. He is unsettled at the beginning of his third year because of the news of Sirius Black, because of his conflict with the Dursleys, because he doesn't know what to expect next. He doesn't know what is going to happen to him. So even when he is spending the end of the summer holiday in Diagon Alley, he is somewhat disconnected from his personal experience, and his reunification with Ron and Hermione in Diagon Alley is a wondrous thing. The return to Hogwarts, an opportunity for celebration, though, of course, events on the Hogwarts Express specifically kind of color that experience somewhat. It's going to be called out to us at the beginning of the next chapter, in fact, that though this is Harry's fourth year, he has only ever experienced one sorting hat ceremony. That's because in the second year, of course, he was late, crashing the Ford Anglia into the Whomping Willow, and then in the third year, recovering from the Dementor attack on the Hogwarts Express. So his relationship with Hogwarts has never been simple. It has never been straightforward. And yet now he is caught in this adolescent ability to normalize. We talked a little about this last time too, that human beings are extremely good at normalizing the fantastical. We are extremely good at becoming familiar with even the most extraordinary set of circumstances. It's entirely possible, if you have been on vacation to some far off, distant, wondrous land, if you've immersed yourself in some culture that is completely unknown to you, after the first few days, you start thinking, yeah, but I mean, I just really want a newspaper, or I just really wish that there was a place I could go to get the coffee like the place down the street serves when I'm back home. Like we can normalize the most fantastical experiences, and Harry, as an adolescent, is perhaps more skilled at normalizing the fantastical experience than anyone else, than any adult would be, because for adolescents, the world is constantly changing, constantly shifting, constantly transforming. They themselves are constantly shifting and changing and transforming. And the ability to adapt swiftly is actually something like a survival mechanism when you are a teenager. Harry here demonstrating that skill perfectly. Yes, as Angela says in the chat here, it's all old hat for Harry now. Experienced 14-year-old POV. I've seen it all now. Yeah, I know what this is. It's just going to be another school year, and we've got divination, and we've got to deal with Snape, and there's no Quidditch. There's no Quidditch this year. You guys, this is so unfair. I hate Hogwarts. I'm going to go to a better school like Durmstrang. This is Harry's, or at least a large part of Harry's emotional palette as we move back into the milieu of Hogwarts here. Yes, as Video Box says here in the Crowdcast chat, plus the world has been normalized for the serial reader, and Rowling needs to keep it new and interesting for us. Yes, and Raven asks rather brilliantly, do you think he's cotton onto the fact he nearly dies every year? I don't think that's Harry's least favorite part about Hogwarts, actually. I don't think like the personal threat to life and liberty is the worst thing about Hogwarts for Harry Potter. I think the worst thing about Hogwarts is, yeah, probably potions class, followed closely by divination class, right? Like homework is the worst thing about Hogwarts for Harry. I think he'd actually quite like it if, I don't know, there was some kind of intramural competition arranged where his life would be on the line on a fairly consistent basis. That kind of thing seems like it might speak to Harry, actually. More on that later in this book. So Harry is normalizing his Hogwarts experience. J.K. Rowling is normalizing the Hogwarts experience. But what is perhaps most surprising and most interesting about this is that Rowling is playing completely fair with the reader, right? She's not artificially trying to buoy Harry's spirits here. She's not trying to generate enthusiasm for Hogwarts. Harry, as the POV character for this part of the book, is not assuring us that Hogwarts is fantastic and magical. Quite the contrary. He's pulling some of the magic and romance out of Hogwarts too. And we'll get this direct opposition, of course, when we arrive back at the school. So from here, we get the brief account of Mad-Eye Moody, and Arthur Weasley rushes off to his aid. And then we move on to the Hogwarts Express itself. Look at that. 2 slides, only 10 minutes in. Ha! This is the pace that we're going to maintain for the entire session, you guys. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming scarlet steam engine, was already there, clouds of steam billowing from it, through which many Hogwarts students and parents on the platform appeared like dark ghosts. Pigwidgeon became noisier than ever in response to the hooting of many owls through the mist. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off to find seats and were soon stowing their luggage in a compartment halfway along the train. They then hopped back down to the platform to say goodbye to Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie. I might be seeing you all sooner than you think, said Charlie, grinning as he hugged Ginny goodbye. Why? Said Fred keenly. You'll see, said Charlie. Just don't tell Percy I mentioned it. It's classified information until such time as the ministry sees fit to release it, after all. Yeah, I sort of wish I were back at Hogwarts this year, said Bill, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully at the train. Why? Said George impatiently. You're going to have an interesting year, said Bill, his eyes twinkling. I might even get time off to come and watch a bit of it. A bit of what? Said Ron. But at that moment, the whistle blew and Mrs. Weasley chivied them on toward the train doors. Charlie and Bill having a little fun at the expense of their siblings here, of course, but also foreshadowing, always foreshadowing, constantly foreshadowing. This year at Hogwarts will be unlike the other years at Hogwarts. And it's interesting that even as we're kind of looking forward to this, even as we're teasing the Triwizard Tournament that's going to be announced in the next chapter, Harry is stepping back from POV, right? We were in Harry's POV at the start of the chapter when he's feeling this kind of end of summer sense of ennui, right? This kind of listless, motivationless nothing that accompanies the end of a holiday period and the return to work or school in this instance. But here, as we're foreshadowing something really interesting, Harry absences himself from the narrative, and we get instead Ron and Fred and George and Ginny to a certain extent, right? We're focused on the Weasleys here as we're foreshadowing something exciting to come. And even here, though, I think we can see, the idea, why, said Fred keenly. Fred is enthusiastic. Well, you'll see. Just don't tell Percy that I mentioned it. It's classified information. Still taking this opportunity here in Charlie's dialogue to mock Percy just a little bit. And then when Bill expresses that he were back at Hogwarts this year, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully at the train. Why? Said George impatiently. It's not just that George is aware that he is being teased. It seems to me that it is incomprehensible to him that any adult should look fondly at school. I like to imagine, when considering platform 9 3/4 and the riotous tumult of students rushing with owls and other familiars and books and luggage behind them, rushing onto the train. I like to imagine the look on the faces of the parents as they watch the Hogwarts Express pull out of the station here, that they are remembering their own school days, and that nostalgic sense of wistfulness that we get, or if you prefer, that wistful sense of nostalgia that we get thinking about our own school days. This wisdom that comes upon every adult just as soon as it is too late to do anything about it, that recognition that most adults, I think, get, that there was something magical about childhood, that even if our childhoods were not particularly great, right? Even if our childhoods were not particularly idyllic themselves, that there were at least elements that we remember fondly. And we remember these things, as is the most human of ways, just as soon as it's too late to do anything to recover them or to enjoy them or to celebrate them. Just as soon as it is outside of our grasp, we realize what it is that we have lost. And I kind of like thinking about Arthur and Molly standing there on the platform after the train has pulled out, and they take a moment with their arms around each other and they just take a beat to remember wistfully their time at Hogwarts, their time experiencing all of the things that their children are now experiencing. But then I am, of course, quite the romantic. Moving into our discussion, Malfoy here remaining the worst. I did receive a couple of interesting thoughts on our discussion last time about the scene with Malfoy in the forest as the Death Eaters are rampaging through the camp, spinning the Roberts family in the air above the wizards. Kind of this theatrical demonstration of the power of the Death Eaters, and by extension, both the power of he who must not be named, and of course, just the dominance of the wizarding world over the Muggle world. That seems to be key to the Death Eaters' kind of propagandist activity here at the Quidditch World Cup. And I did receive a couple of interesting perspectives on this, saying, well, isn't it interesting that Draco's in the forest? Isn't it interesting that Draco, though he is awful, though he is, singularly and specifically and newly awful, isn't it interesting that he is actually withholding himself from this action? Is this a sign of a division within Draco Malfoy's personality? And I'm not sure that it is, but I'm also not completely sure that it isn't. I can't dismiss it outright. It feels to me, upon reading the text, that we are removing Draco from the adult world in exactly the same way as we remove Harry, Ron, and Hermione from the adult world, right? We pull them into the forest. We pull them into the periphery of the wild and tumultuous events that are occurring at the Quidditch World Cup because they are not yet a part of that world. We are kind of preserving this little bubble of adolescent space off to the side, and within that, we're having adolescent interactions. That seems to be part of what we're doing there. We're taking Draco out of the adult world, but preserving his antagonistic state and his internal animosity, of course, within the sphere of his own influence, right? We're kind of sequestering away a little Hogwarts party here amidst the riot that is consuming the Quidditch World Cup here. But it is possible to read that too as Draco holding himself at one remove. There's no real way of doing that in this sequence, unfortunately. So let's look at this and we'll see what we make of Draco. Shh, Hermione whispered suddenly, pressing her finger to her lips and pointing toward the compartment next to theirs. Harry and Ron listened and heard a familiar, drawling voice drifting in through the open door. Father actually considered sending me to Durmstrang rather than Hogwarts, you know. He knows the headmaster, you see. Well, you know his opinion of Dumbledore. The man's such a mudblood lover, and Durmstrang doesn't admit that sort of riffraff. But Mother didn't like the idea of me going to school so far away. Father says Durmstrang takes a far more sensible line than Hogwarts about the dark arts. Durmstrang students actually learn them, not just the defense rubbish we do. Hermione got up, tiptoed to the compartment door and slid it shut, blocking out Malfoy's voice. So he thinks Durmstrang would have suited him, does he? She said angrily. I wish he had gone, then we wouldn't have to put up with him. Durmstrang's another wizarding school? Said Harry. Yes, said Hermione sniffly, and it's got a horrible reputation. According to an appraisal of magical education in Europe, it puts a lot of emphasis on the dark arts. I think I've heard of it, said Ron vaguely. Where is it? What country? Well, nobody knows, do they? Said Hermione, raising her eyebrows. Why not? Said Harry. There's traditionally been a lot of rivalry between all the magic schools. Durmstrang and Beauxbaton like to conceal their whereabouts so nobody can steal their secrets, said Hermione matter-of-factly. Said Hermione matter-of-factly / insanely, asserting something that is just borderline incomprehensible, just really quite weird, given in particular that Victor Crumb is going to be associated very closely with Durmstrang in the near future and has, of course, previously been associated with Durmstrang too, and we know that he plays in the Bulgarian team. I mean, feels as though we have at least a sense of where Durmstrang is, and the idea that they would conceal their physical location so as to preserve secrecy around their school, around what, their curriculum, around their practices, that feels wildly excessive and a little inconsistent with what we get later, honestly. But we are, at least within the frame of the narrative right here, preserving the mystery about Durmstrang, preserving the mystery about Beauxbaton too, that we are leaning on the idea that Durmstrang is at least, well, certainly more progressive in their response to the dark arts, right? They're more inclusive when it comes to teaching about the dark arts, not just the defense stuff, not just the Dada stuff that we get at Hogwarts, but a much more engaged and substantial curriculum at Durmstrang. And of course, it makes sense that Lucius Malfoy should know the headmaster of Durmstrang, and then it should be ultimately an appropriate place for Draco Malfoy too. C-Star says, it makes me wonder how dark arts is defined. I think of it as a magical crime, sort of, things good people don't do, but that doesn't mesh with Durmstrang legally teaching them if it actually does so, which from what we learn later is unclear. Yes, the rumors about Durmstrang seem to be that much more cynical, that much more suggestive than the actual truth about Durmstrang, which again kind of makes it incomprehensible that they preserve their secrets to this degree. Secrecy in the wizarding world, generally not good. At the very least, secrecy in the wizarding world is used as a as a means of rendering in comedic terms the secret keeper. Okay, the secret keeper, maybe not a phrase that I wanted to inadvertently use there or casually use there. People who keep secrets are at the very least objects of ridicule, right? Percy keeps secrets. Cornelius Fudge keeps secrets. People who keep secrets are generally doing so for comedic effect or are rendered in comedic terms as a consequence of that secrecy. And beyond that, secrets are kept by people who are suspicious, people who are dark in the capital D wizarding sense, I suppose. Is there an element of dark artistry in that there are outright evil things? Well, yes, actually, yes. And you know what? We're going to cover that next week. We're going to cover that in the first chapter of next week's reading when we get to the unforgivable curses, right? There are just things in the wizarding world which are objectively evil. Are the dark arts synonymous with things which are objectively evil? Well, no, I don't think so. If we think back to last year's experiences with Professor Lupin, of course, and we think about, our defense against naturally occurring magical creatures, the dark art there is not conscious, doesn't seem to be purposeful, doesn't seem to be an act of commission as much as it is the natural consequence of this structure, of this form, of this outlook on the world. Dark arts include all things which are threatening to wizards, it would seem. That certainly seems to be consistent with what we've discussed previously, even if we go back to Chamber of Secrets and we talk about Gilderoy Lockhart and the many books that he had written. It's not just about the acts of dark wizardry, it is about anything which is threatening, right? Defense against the dark arts is also just defensive magic. Those are synonymous, it would seem, at Hogwarts, at least within the first 3 years. Maybe we'll get something different in the fourth year. Let's see how that works out when we get there. But yes, I think that's the division there that we're looking at. And yes, we're going to Alexis asks, aren't the dark arts just the side that isn't drawing from the light? It's not necessarily bad or evil, though it often is. Again, we're invited by this line of thought, right? By this chain of speculation, we are invited to question the underpinnings of J.K. Rowling's magical system, and there just isn't enough there. There just isn't enough substance. We're going to get, in the chapter describing the unforgivable curses, we're going to get our first and clearest perspective on what is evil. I guess not our first. We've had some hints of this before, of course. The spilling of unicorn blood back in The Philosopher's Stone is recognized as a pretty unequivocally evil act. But defense against the dark arts, I guess all I'm saying is defense against the dark arts is not simply about evil wizardry and the defending against evil wizardry. It is also about defending yourself against all natural threats, natural and unnatural threats, I suppose. Okay, let's, Spencer Kuhn says, Ashley thought it was a bit odd that Lupin's class was all creatures. Seems more like Care of Magical Creatures to me, right? Certainly in the third book, I think that's true. And again, in the second book, to a certain extent, at least there are elements of that in the syllabus laid out by Gilderoy Lockhart, though, of course, what do we make of, the lessons taught by Professor Quirrell and the lessons taught by Gilderoy Lockhart are perhaps not actually good examples of what a Defense Against the Dark Arts class should be. We certainly don't question Lupin's credentials as a professor of that class. That is not the reason that he has departed from Hogwarts. So maybe that is our best perspective on what Dada should be within the frame of Hogwarts, at least. But yes, certainly, the allegations here about Durmstrang will turn out to be at least arguably unfounded. We'll talk more about that when we get to the introduction of these characters. This then is our last slide from chapter 11. And some more foreshadowing, you guys. Hey, are you good for foreshadowing? Because here's just a little extra to tide you over until we actually get to the reveal. Look at this, said Malfoy in ecstasy, holding up Ron's robes and showing Crabbe and Goyle. Weasley, you weren't thinking of wearing these, were you? I mean, they were very fashionable in about 1890. Eat dung, Malfoy, said Ron, the same color as the dress robes as he snatched them back out of Malfoy's grip. Malfoy howled with derisive laughter. Crabbe and Goyle guffawed stupidly. So, going to enter, Weasley? Going to try and bring a bit of glory to the family name? There's money involved as well, You'll be able to afford some decent robes if you won. What are you talking about? Snapped Ron. Are you going to enter? Malfoy repeated. I suppose you will, Potter. You never miss a chance to show off, do you? Either explain what you're on about or go away, Malfoy, said Hermione testily over the top of the Standard Book of Spells, grade 4. A gleeful smile spread across Malfoy's pale face. Don't tell me you don't know, he said delightedly. You've got a father and brother at the ministry and that you don't even know? My God, my father told me about it ages ago. Heard it from Cornelius Fudge. But then father's always associated with the top people at the ministry. Maybe your father's too junior to know about it, Weasley. Yes, they probably don't talk about important stuff in front of him. Laughing once more, Malfoy beckoned to Crabbe and Goyle, and the three of them disappeared. Ron got to his feet and slammed the sliding compartment door so hard behind them that the glass shattered. One of the most interesting details here, not that Draco Malfoy knows about the Triwizard Tournament, not that he is teasing the others, our power trio, about the Triwizard Tournament, but one of the most interesting little details here that I collected only after my fourth or fifth reading of this book is that Malfoy is intimately familiar with the workings of the Weasley family, right? He knows about Percy. Percy has not been working at the ministry for that long, and Percy is, no matter what perspective you adopt, pretty much a nobody, and yet Malfoy doesn't just know this, he deploys this information. It is somewhat suggestive of a kind of obsession, I think, between Malfoy and the power trio, or at least our Slytherin power trio and our Gryffindor power trio, right? The idea of Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle being somehow reflective of Harry, Ron, and Hermione. This is not a reflection which is ever adequately explored, I would argue, or adequately explored suggests that it is inadequately explored. It is potentially reflective in a really interesting way. We don't actually do anything with it. It's just left fallow. Crabbe and Goyle do not function within the frame of the plot, within the frame of the series as meaningful mirrors to Ron and Hermione. Rather, they are just flunkies for Draco Malfoy, which is completely fine. We don't necessarily need to pick up every opportunity for narrative symmetry that we are presented with, but it would be interesting there. So anyway, all of this is to say that Draco Malfoy continuing to be the worst. We are continuing also to get foreshadowing. And here we're already back into this kind of this Hogwarts-oriented drama, right? And I mentioned right back at the beginning of today's session that one of the things that J.K. Rowling is doing in this chapter, and arguably in the next chapter, and definitively in chapter 13, Mad-Eye Moody, is drawing breath. We are settling back into life at Hogwarts, and we are forgetting to a certain degree about recent troubles. We are forgetting about the Dark Mark, and we're forgetting about the Death Eaters. We're forgetting about everything that has led us up to this point, because those things are a part of the adult world, and we are now, again, aboard the Hogwarts Express in this liminal state. We are caught between worlds. Interestingly, we are not caught, in Harry's experience, between the Muggle world and the Wizarding world, as we have been previously. True definitively in the first book, true even in the second book, as he and Ron fly the Ford Anglia to Hogwarts. True to a certain extent in the third book, though Harry's transition there is more subtle, I think, and less stark and immediate. The Hogwarts Express is still a liminal state. It is still descriptive of his transition from the Muggle world to the Wizarding world, but crucially in the third book, it isn't safe. Crucially in the third book, the outside threat of the core plot of that novel pushes back against that liminality itself. Here in the fourth book, well, we're kind of liminal again. We're kind of back where we were, except we're not transitioning from the Muggle world to the Wizarding world as much as we are transitioning from the adult world back into the adolescent world. That's the transition that we're delineating here. So all of our conflicts drop in scale and severity. All of our threats diminish again. We are now back in what is ostensibly at least a governed state. We are back at school. Yeah. Okay, let me see here. Carmine says that we need a drink to play the liminal drinking game. Hey, look, we're going to talk about the Hogwarts Express. We're going to be doing the liminal drinking game. It's the only way that we can describe the Hogwarts Express. Let's leave liminality behind then. Let's step across this threshold and move into chapter 12, the Triwizard Tournament, arriving as we are inevitably going to at the Great Hall. The Great Hall looked its usual splendid self, decorated for the start of term feast. Golden plates and goblets gleamed by the light of hundreds and hundreds of candles floating over the tables in midair. The 4 long house tables were packed with chattering students. At the top of the hall, the staff sat along one side of a 5th table, facing their pupils. It was much warmer in here. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked past the Slytherins, the Ravenclaws, and the Hufflepuffs, and sat down with the rest of the Gryffindors at the far side of the hall, next to nearly headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost. Pearly, white, and semi-transparent, Nick was dressed tonight in his usual doublet, but with a particularly large ruff, which served the dual purpose of looking extra festive and ensuring that his head didn't wobble too much on his partially severed neck. "Good evening," he said, beaming at them. Says who? Said Harry, taking off his sneakers and emptying them of water. Hope they hurry up with the sorting. I'm starving. The sorting of the new students into houses took place at the start of every school year, but by an unlucky combination of circumstances, Harry hadn't been present at one since his own. He was quite looking forward to it. Just then, a highly excited, breathless voice called down the table. Hiya, Harry! It was Colin Creevy, a third year to whom Harry was something of a hero. Hi, Colin, said Harry warily. Harry, guess what? Guess what? Harry, my brother's starting, my brother Dennis. Good, said Harry. He's really excited, said Colin, practically bouncing up and down in his seat. I just hope he's in Gryffindor. Keep your fingers crossed, eh, Harry? Yeah, all right, said Harry. He turned back to Hermione, Ron, and nearly headless Nick. Brothers and sisters usually go in the same houses, don't they? He said. He was judging by the Weasleys, all 7 of whom had been put into Gryffindor. Oh, no, not necessarily, said Hermione. Pravati Patil's twins in Ravenclaw, and they're identical. You'd think they'd be together, wouldn't you? We're just avoiding the idea here that there is any rhyme or reason to the sorting of these children. More on that in just a moment. Raven Darkholm is asking here in the chat, does particularly large ruff suggest that Nick changes his clothes? Yes, absolutely, it does. And that struck me too. It is very interesting that the ghosts can change their appearance to some degree. I'm struck reading this chapter as we emerge from the Hogwarts Express and travel in the carriages through the storm and enter into the foyer of Hogwarts, up the staircase into the foyer of Hogwarts, already drenched, of course, only to find Peeves launching water bottles down at the students as they arrive, Minerva McGonagall sliding around in a certain state of disarray. It's anarchic, and it is devoid almost entirely of wonder. And it also puts a real focus on the ghosts. We're also going to get a beat in a moment about Peeves being invited to the banquet and actually not being invited to the banquet because the Bloody Baron puts his foot down, and the Bloody Baron, the Slytherin house ghost, is the only one who can control Peeves. We're really introducing the more supernatural elements of Hogwarts at this point in a way that isn't necessary for ongoing readers of the series and seems to be priming our understanding of what is to come, but not really. This isn't really functional, substantial foreshadowing. This is just a new perspective on Hogwarts because, I would argue, Harry is now terribly familiar with most everything else. We get that beat, of course. Good evening, he said, beaming at them. Says who? Said Harry, taking off his sneakers and emptying them of water. Hope they hurry up with the sorting. I'm starving. And then we get the turn, right? The pivot. The sorting of the new students into houses took place at the start of every school year by an unlucky combination of circumstances. Harry hadn't been present at one since his own. Hey, we might think, maybe this would be cool for Harry. Maybe this is something that Harry's really looking forward to. Oh, the narrative confirms. He was quite looking forward to it. Well, if he's quite looking forward to it, why is he so impatient for it to be over so that he can eat? Why is he so miserable with nearly headless Nick? Because his shoes are wet? Because he's somewhat uncomfortable? He's back at Hogwarts, you guys. He's starting his 4th year. This is a huge moment for Harry. And yet he is either sincerely disenchanted or, arguably, adopting a kind of cool affect here, right? Why is he pushing past the sorting to get to the food? Why is he grumbling at nearly headless Nick and yet simultaneously looking forward to the sorting, which does seem to be more authentic, right? That seems to be more true of our understanding of Harry's emotional range and response, certainly. Oh, yes, C-Star's calling out here that he adores, that she, excuse me, C-Star, I hope I'm gendering you correctly, C-Star, in the way that you would like. I hope that's your pronoun of choice. C-Star says, I adored Colin and Dennis in this chapter. I completely agree, right? The appearance of Colin, and of course, Harry's response to Colin. We understand Harry's relationship with Colin. We understand that Colin can be a little overbearing, but in the context of his end of summer gloom and the context of his somewhat, subdued return to Hogwarts and the storm raging outside, all of which in a previous year would only have served to make this feel more magical, of course, but to Harry now is just inconvenient, just uncomfortable. This isn't magical. This just sucks, kind of. He just wants the sorting to be over so he can eat and he can get into his school year, about which he doesn't seem to be particularly excited anyway. And then he's pushing back against Colin too. Hi, Colin, he said warily. Colin's enthusiasm doing nothing to kind of buoy Harry's spirits here, to raise Harry's level of enthusiasm. We're going to look at the sorting song here, the 1994 sorting song version. Yes, outward Harry, meh, inward Harry, ooh, yay, says Ty Easton. Actually, I think pretty accurate there, potentially, at least, yes. I like very much the idea that Harry is is kind of adopting a cool outward appearance. You know, oh, fourth year at Hogwarts, I'm so over this. Like, yeah, I'm just chilling with Ron and Hermione, and we've seen everything there is to see. And did I mention that my life's been in danger like 15 times now? I'm good, thanks. No, I like the idea that there's still a little spark of enthusiasm from Harry. I'm a little afraid that we're building that off of that one line. He was quite looking forward to it, is about as much as we get to support any kind of enthusiasm from Harry whatsoever in the course of this chapter. But nonetheless, here we are. Yes, Becca says, I love that the Sorting Hat just waits around making up songs while as Ron observes, of course. It must be quite boring being a hat all the time. We are going to look at the 1994, the fourth year Sorting Hat song. But before we do that, I want to look back at the first Sorting Hat song, the Sorting Hat song that Harry heard in his first year at Hogwarts back in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hat sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts Sorting Hat, and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the Sorting Hat can't see. So try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. This is the Sorting Hat song that introduces us to the notion of houses at Hogwarts, right? I guess not quite introduces us, but kind of defines our first year perspective on the houses. And we talked about this a lot back in the first run of Dear Mr. Potter, back when I was discussing Philosopher's Stone, because we get here the perspective on Hufflepuffs. Hufflepuffs, just, loyal, true, unafraid of toil. These are the definitive virtues of the Hufflepuff. Or the Ravenclaw, a ready mind, wit and learning. That's what you associate with Ravenclaw. In Slytherin, cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. Not just ambition, they have ends, not just ambition, but ruthlessness. They will use any means. And what do we get from Gryffindor? Daring, nerve, chivalry, the brave at heart. So loyal, steadfast, and hardworking, smart, studious, dedicated, ambitious, ruthless, merciless, and super brave. Just like really, really, really brave. Those are the defining characteristics of our houses. And I don't want to beat this drum too much because A, it feels like we talk about this in every session of Dear Mr. Potter, and B, we have already acknowledged that our understanding of the houses has evolved. This is why I'm calling up this first book perspective on the houses here from the Sorting Hat and contrasting it with the fourth book perspective on the houses here. Yes, C-Star says, I'll eat myself instead of I'll eat my hat. It's good. I mean, it's well written and the meter is quite lovely. It is interesting that Ron notes that the Sorting Hat probably spends all year coming up with a new song, given that the new song, which the Sorting Hat has spent all year writing, is in exactly the same meter. The only difference between the 1991 Sorting Hat song and the 1994 Sorting Hat song is that the new Sorting Hat song has one extra stanza. That's it. That's the only difference. In fact, let's take a look at that. 1,000 years or more ago, when I was newly sown, there lived 4 wizards of renown whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wild Moor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers. Thus Hogwarts School began. Now, each of these 4 founders formed their own house, for each did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindor, the bravest were prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff, hard workers were most worthy of admission, and power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. While still alive, they did divide their favorites from the throng. Yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way. He whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug about your ears. I've never yet been wrong. I'll have a look inside your mind and tell where you belong. Though this song starts in a very different place, it is in form and structure almost identical to the previous song, and in ultimate purpose, I think, almost identical to the previous song. That is, this song introduces tangentially the notions of houses, right? It defines the characteristics associated with each house, but more than that, it's a song about the Sorting Hat itself. The first song is from start to finish a song about the hat. This one starts with the history of Hogwarts, but then comes closer and closer to the present, closer to the gifting of brains to the Sorting Hat, to Godric Gryffindor's old hat, I suppose. In its focus, though, on the founding of Hogwarts, in its focus on the initial division of the student body according to the values prized most highly by each of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, it does something absolutely crucial to our understanding of the Hogwarts houses. This is something that is going to break open our discussion of Hogwarts houses for the rest of the series. It is very tempting in the first 3 books to look at in the first 3 books, arguably in the rest of the series if we're not paying close attention, and certainly in the halo of associated material which accompanies Harry Potter, right? Pottermore has made an entire industry out of exactly this kind of analysis, but it is very tempting to look at the Hogwarts house structure as though it is some kind of definitive personality test. Well, you must be one. You have to be somewhere. You have to belong in one of these houses, as though loyal and smart and brave and ruthless were, you know, the 4 primary characteristics of humanity, as though those were like elemental personality quirks, right? We oppose these 4 things in some kind of complicated structure. And I'm just not sure that that's true. I've never been sure that that's true. And here the Sorting Hat explains how we arrived here. Well, no one is saying that these virtues are definitive. No one is saying that there aren't other virtues out there. No one is saying that every kid is perfectly representative of one of these 4 types. Rather, what we're saying is that these are the virtues prized by the founders of Hogwarts. By Gryffindor, the bravest were prized far beyond the rest. Great, that actually makes perfect sense. What is it that you value? Godric Gryffindor? Oh, okay, you value courage. Excellent. So you can pick the bravest kids and you want to teach them? That's great, you do that. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff, hard workers were most worthy of admission. And there's a twist there. Hufflepuff, not afraid of toil, as we learned in the 1991 song. But here we're putting the focus on the industry of the Hufflepuff student body, the individual Hufflepuffs. They work hard. That is distinct from the notion that Hufflepuffs are chiefly loyal, right? Also, they are loyal. Also, they are steadfast, but they work hard. They are, I suppose in a broader sense, we might kind of unify all of those Hufflepuffian virtues into one kind of, in a sense, Hufflepuffs are indefatigable, right? In a sense, Hufflepuffs are steadfast, whether it is with regard to their work or their friendships or their beliefs or, you know, their interactions with the world in general. That seems to be the primary Hufflepuff virtue. But here, the focus is put on their sense of industry. And power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. The association there, too, you'll note that we don't get descriptors for each of the founders of Hogwarts in those stanzas, right? We get that second stanza. Bold Gryffindor from Wild Moor. So Gryffindor himself was brave. Fair Ravenclaw from Glen. Okay, not smart Ravenclaw, not wise Ravenclaw, fair Ravenclaw. Rowena Ravenclaw noted most within the frame of this song for her beauty. Sweet Hufflepuff, right? Sweet, harmless Hufflepuff here. That again, not hardworking, not industrious. That we'd have trouble fitting those into the meter, right? But not even loyal. You know, you can just elide that A there. Loy''L. Loyal Hufflepuff from Valley Broad. No, sweet Hufflepuff, good-natured Hufflepuff is what we get, and shrewd Slytherin. Even then, not quite the ultimate perspective on Salazar Slytherin, right? The idea of shrewdness, I mean, connotatively, it is associated with cunning. It is associated with and of course, I'm not thinking of the works of Professor Tolkien. I'm not thinking of The Lord of the Rings. I'm not thinking of Saruman, right? Saruman, absolutely a Slytherin, 1,000% a Slytherin. But I'm thinking that shrewdness here could also be arguably associated with Ravenclaw. That Ravenclaws are supposed to be shrewd in the sense that they are capable of great discernment, in the sense that they are capable of great wisdom and understanding. That may be a Ravenclaw virtue more than a Slytherin virtue. But that's not what we get. We get bold Gryffindor. Okay, check. Thank goodness, right? Bold Gryffindor, brave Gryffindor. Here we are. Excellent. Fair Ravenclaw? Well, all right, kind of. Sweet Hufflepuff? Kind of. More so than Ravenclaw, but not definitive there. Shrewd Slytherin from Fen, from the Swampland. I mean, pretty perfect, actually, for our understanding of Slytherin, but also not quite as specific as we might expect. Then when we get to the virtues that they look for in the student body, there is a question over how directly they look for students who embody their own virtues, right? It's easy to kind of look past this. What I'm saying is, there is clear evidence in this song, in the history of Hogwarts, as we understand it to this point. And obviously, there's a lot of extra material out there, but we're doing our textual analysis on this poem. As we understand it at this point, Godric Gryffindor was brave. Check. Bold Gryffindor from Wild Moor. By Gryffindor, the bravest were prized far beyond the rest. Okay, he was brave, and he liked bravery as a primary virtue. Makes a lot of sense. Rowena Ravenclaw, fair Ravenclaw from Glen. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest would always be the best. There's nothing in this song that suggests that Rowena Ravenclaw herself was particularly smart, that she was noted for her intellect, not smart Ravenclaw, not wise Ravenclaw, fair Ravenclaw. There's a distinction there, right? And the same is true of Hufflepuff. Sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, for Hufflepuff hard workers were most worthy of admission. Sweetness and industry do not necessarily go together, right? We're not necessarily conflating the virtue of the students most favored by Hufflepuff or the students who find themselves in House Hufflepuff now with the virtues of the third founder of Hogwarts. There's a distinction there, or at least a possible distinction there. But then we come back to Slytherin. Shrewd Slytherin from Fan and power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. And you'll notice there that we get power-hungry there within the frame of that stanza. That's the only descriptor that we get as we're describing the virtues associated with each house. By Gryffindor, the bravest were prized far beyond the rest. Doesn't say anything about Gryffindor, right? Except that he valued bravery and courage. For Ravenclaw, the cleverest would always be the best. Doesn't say anything about Ravenclaw. For Hufflepuff, hard workers were most worthy of admission. No adjective there associated with Hufflepuff. And power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. Ah, okay. So now we're getting the emphasis here where it ought to be, as it were. Now we're seeing that Slytherin valued not just ambition in the abstract, but valued their own primary characteristic above all others. While still alive, they did divide their favorites from the throng. While still alive, they did divide their favorites from the throng. Yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? They did divide their favorites from the throng does not suggest to me that originally the student body of Hogwarts was divided into 4 houses. What it suggests to me is that each of the founders of Hogwarts took a number of students from the student body and educated them personally. That this was a different kind of relationship. This is, by the way, not in keeping with the academic structure at Hogwarts, which we see in the course of the Harry Potter series, right? There is no sense in which Gryffindors get a fundamentally different education than the Hufflepuffs do, or the Ravenclaws do, or the Slytherins do. There's just no sense in which the academic syllabus as presented at Hogwarts is different or substantially varies from house to house to house. This is just a concession to their individual characteristics, to their primary virtues, as it were. 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way, he whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug about your... Well, okay, let's not run too far past that, I guess. The founders put some brains in me so I could choose instead. See also the ongoing discussion about whether or not the sorting hat actually picks the house for the student or the student picks the house themselves. That is a point of open speculation all the way back from the first book, right? All the way back from Harry's first interaction with the sorting hat, and continues to be a point of speculation as we go forward. What are the odds that all 7 Weasleys are going to be sorted into Gryffindor? Except that the Weasleys believe that they are going to be sorted into Gryffindor, right? What is it that separates Hermione from identical Hermione, right? Hermione's twin who ends up in Ravenclaw, theoretically, right? Those 2 characters are fundamentally the same, and yet distinct only because Hermione seems to have some kind of spark of heroism about her that is not usually associated with Ravenclaw. Now, slip me snug about your ears. I've never yet been wrong. The infallibility of the sorting hat is true not just textually, right? This is true in the first book, in the fourth book. It is true through to the end of the Harry Potter series. It is true in all the extra textual material. J.K. Rowling was once asked, has the sorting hat ever been wrong? And the reply was a flat no. No, the sorting hat has never been wrong. Okay, we'll have some discussions about that much later, I'm sure. I'll have a look inside your mind and tell where you belong. I will discern from within you where it is that you fit in this hierarchy, where it is that you fit. Hierarchy is probably the wrong word, except that it functionally isn't, right? Where you fit in this schema, where you fit in this architectural layout for the school. Yeah, okay. Raven Darkham quoting Arthur Weasley here. Don't talk to anything if you can't see where it keeps its brain. Good, solid advice there. Yes, good, solid advice. Laurie's saying maybe at that point not everyone went to school. I think referring to the founders choosing their favorites from the throng. That may well be true, right? If Hogwarts is the first educational institution for wizards in the United Kingdom, it is entirely possible that prior to the establishment of Hogwarts, kids were just educated at home, and it is possible that rather than picking favorites from a student body, the founders of Hogwarts picked a student body from the broader population. That makes a certain amount of sense, though that too, we must recognize, has now changed in the manner of, British schooling, I suppose. There is now provisioned schooling for every young wizard in the land, and it's at Hogwarts. Though I am curious, and I was thinking about this last week as we were discussing wizard money, I am curious if there were a wizarding family that was even more poverty-stricken than the Weasleys, right? Who was flatly incapable of supplying their child with the appropriate dress robes or wand or textbooks or cauldron or whatever for the school year ahead. Is there some kind of scholarship system at Hogwarts that would provision those materials? Like, I can't imagine Ginny Weasley showing up on the first day of term without a cauldron and only with half of her textbooks, and Minerva McGonagall not immediately supplying those things. That feels as though that's something that would happen at Hogwarts, and yet of course we just don't have a complete sense of how this school works. It's almost as though it wasn't it's almost as though the series wasn't primarily focused on the administrative back end of Hogwarts, which of course it isn't, which is why we are going to now discover that there have been house elves here the whole time. Hermione had knocked over her golden goblet. Pumpkin juice spread steadily over the tablecloth, staining several feet of white linen orange, but Hermione paid no attention. "There are house elves here," she said, staring horror-struck at Nearly Headless Nick. "Here at Hogwarts?" "Certainly," said Nearly Headless Nick, looking surprised at her reaction. "The largest number in any dwelling in Britain, I believe, over 100. "I've never seen one," said Hermione. "Well, they hardly ever leave the kitchen by day, do they?" said Nearly Headless Nick. "They come out at night to do a bit of cleaning, see to the fires and so on. I mean, you're not supposed to see them, are you? That's the mark of a good house elf, isn't it? That you don't know it's there?" Hermione stared at him. "But they get paid," she said. "They get holidays, don't they? And sick leave and pensions and everything?" Nearly Headless Nick chortled so much that his ruff slipped and his head flopped off, dangling on the inch or so of ghostly skin and muscle that still attached it to his neck. "Sick leave and pensions," he said, pushing his head back onto his shoulders and securing it once more with his ruff. "House elves don't want sick leave and pensions." Hermione looked down at her hardly touched plate of food and put her knife and fork down upon it and pushed it away from her. "Oh, come on, Hermione," said Ron, accidentally spraying Harry with bits of Yorkshire pudding. "Oops, sorry, Harry," he swallowed. "You won't get them sick leave by starving yourself." "Slave labor," said Hermione, breathing hard through her nose. "That's what made this dinner slave labor." And she refused to eat another bite. We've talked a little about the juvenile politics of this novel. We've talked a little about the juvenile politics of Hermione's response to the forcible slavery and domination of house elves. It is juvenile in the sense that it is unsophisticated within the frame of the story, right? It is purposefully unsophisticated within the frame of the story. We are going to be invited to, if not laugh, then perhaps roll our eyes at Hermione through the course of this book because of her pursuit of house elf rights. It is also somewhat juvenile outside of the frame of this book. This is, I think, an unwise bit of real world referencing within the fictional frame that is insufficiently nuanced and insufficiently thoughtful. I fear that if we address this topic with any great purpose, that it is going to completely dominate our discussion of this entire subplot. And I don't really want to do that. Again, what I want to do is meet the text on its own terms and kind of try to follow the movement of the narrative lens and follow the direction of the story in terms of how we are supposed to perceive these things, and not necessarily to adopt that without question, right? As we have repeatedly, we will find ourselves at odds with the narrative lens quite often in the course of this book, but I don't necessarily want to dismiss the text itself and replace it with a real world political discourse, which is far more, I would argue, informed and thoughtful and important, but far less true to the heart of this story. That said, I mean, the slavery of house elves is a terrible thing, but it is also inaccurately, well-intentionedly, I'm sure, right? With the best of intentions, J.K. Rowling is raising this topic, I think, talking about bigotry, talking about prejudice, all of these things, very, very strong. But we are treading into some really delicate and emotive, conversational and discursive tropes here, right? The idea that, well, house elves don't want sick leaves and pensions, that's an absurd thought. This is really close to the kind of rhetoric that occurred around real-world slavery and the real-world domination of entire populations in our not-so-distant past, right? And indeed, even today in certain parts of the world and in certain social classes and cultures. And even we can extend it out beyond slavery to, you know, the kind of rhetoric associated with the politics of poverty or the politics of certainly the politics of race, the politics of identity, the politics of gender. When we ruthlessly other entire demographics, entire populations in exactly this way, we are evoking, and within the fictional frame, when we relegate to a subhuman state or to a non-sapient state, because of course, it's not that house elves are subhuman, it is that house elves are non-human, right? So we're not questioning their humanity because they're not human, in the same way as we're not questioning the humanity of a centaur. What we are questioning, though, is the sapience, right? Is the personhood of the house elf, or the personhood of the centaur, or the goblin, or any other creature, any other of the magical creatures, including the Vila and the leprechauns that we discussed back at the Quidditch World Cup. I don't necessarily want to dive too deeply into all of that. Not because it isn't important. It is crucially important, and there is a whole discourse surrounding this theme in particular, which is of vital significance. These conversations are very, very important indeed, but to have these conversations, we're pulling back against the intent of the text. And that is not to say that the text is more important than real-world politics and real-world social awareness, right? That is not the argument that I'm making at all. The argument that I'm making is simply that we are here to parse and interpret the text. That is the purpose of this series of discussions, rather than a purpose about the politics, the real-world applicability of the politics of Harry Potter. Again, for those of you who are joining the discussion late, we will be having some roundtable discussions about race and gender and representation and diversity in the works of Harry Potter. Stay tuned for those. Those are going to be the best places, I think, to have these discussions. Let me see where we are here. As I scroll back a little bit, there were some good comments here that I was missing. Yes, Spencer Kuhn says, I always felt the reader was supposed to disagree with the arguments from most wizards about house elves. Yes, absolutely. But that does not mean that there aren't elements of dog whistle rhetoric associated with these arguments, right? The co-opting of real world rhetoric into a fictional frame is difficult anyway, under any circumstances. And the fact that the narrative is kind of dissuading us from being convinced by those arguments, the idea that we are ostensibly, theoretically, at least supposed to be siding with Hermione at this point, which of course we are, right? Nearly Headless Nick is a figure of ridicule. He is a figure who exists to be mocked. He exists in this chapter so that he can be an object of ridicule in this particular exchange. That is why he is in the story at this point. And then we've got Ron, this gluttonous, oafish figure all of a sudden, right? Spraying bits of Yorkshire pudding like he were a Dursley across the dining room table at Hermione. We're also clearly not supposed to empathize with him. And Harry, again, has kind of retreated from the frame here. Harry's not interposing himself on this discussion right now. We are supposed to believe that Hermione is right. We do, I think, believe that Hermione is right. That is going to be somewhat more difficult and more uncomfortable later in the book when Hermione herself becomes something of an object of ridicule, and we can definitely discuss when we get to that point to what degree that is intentional. To what degree are we supposed to be laughing at Hermione, and to what degree are we laughing at Hermione because of a flaw in the execution of the storytelling? That's kind of the distinction that I want to draw there. Was just thinking, says Cecily here, elves can do magic, but as I remember, it's a rather low-level magic. Is this a result of them not being taught the proper use of magic? Oh, Cecily, you're inviting me into a very large point of discussion here that I would absolutely love to have. House elf magic is not low-level magic. House elf magic is apparently, by all accounts, extremely sophisticated magic. House elves can apparate into and out of Hogwarts. To pick one example, right? One powerful example. House elves can apparate into and out of Hogwarts in a way that other wizards cannot. House elves can do things that would be impractical, if not outright impossible, for even the most skilled wizards, and they do it all the time, every day. It's remarkable what house elves are capable of accomplishing. But I do think you've put the nail on the head there, right? They haven't been taught the quote unquote proper way to do magic, which brings us back to the discussion about the teaching of magic at Hogwarts and the way in which the wizarding world, the human wizarding world, I guess, okay, the wizarding world, capital W, as distinct from the magical world inhabited by centaurs and goblins and leprechauns and so on and so forth, right? The wizarding world takes this very formalistic approach to the teaching of magic. Here is the spell. Here is how you perform the spell. You do it with the swish and the flick, and this is how it all works. Don't try anything else because it's incredibly dangerous. You might get splinched or worse if you try to spontaneously cast magic. None of that seems to be true of the house elves. And yet the house elves seem to be as powerful, arguably as powerful as human wizards. More on that later. Yes, C-Star's saying, for teenage me, it was an early lesson in activism, the need to listen to the people you want to help. Yes, this is where Hermione misses the point, right? Unfortunately, we do get into some, yeah, as I say, the imitation, arguably inadvertent imitation of some really problematic political rhetoric at that point. But yes, this is the adolescent story rearing its head here. Yeah. Exactly right. C-Star also says, a commentator on another Harry Potter reread compared Hermione trying to free house elves to someone declaring that the centaurs in the forest were homeless and should be put in houses when that isn't what centaurs want. Yes, in part. Centaurs are not serving in Hogwarts, serving in the houses of the great families of the wizarding realm is not a natural state for elves, though, right? They were not innately house elves. More on this later. I think we'll put a large pin in this, which I know will make Angela very happy. We'll come back to this later as we'll talk about humanity and inhumanity. Yes. Good. Okay, let's keep pushing onward. I have half an hour left before I get to that hard out, and we have, 5 more slides to do? We can definitely do this. Let's move ever onward here. And the introduction of one Mad-Eye Moody. A man stood in the doorway, leaning upon a long staff shrouded in a black traveling cloak. Every head in the great hall swiveled toward the stranger, suddenly brightly illuminated by a fork of lightning that flashed across the ceiling. He lowered his hood, shook out a long mane of grizzled, dark gray hair, then began to walk up toward the teacher's table. A dull clunk echoed through the hall on his every other step. He reached the end of the top table, turned right, and limped heavily toward Dumbledore. Another flash of lightning crossed the ceiling. Hermione gasped. The lightning had thrown the man's face into sharp relief, and it was a face unlike any Harry had ever seen. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what human faces are supposed to look like, and was none too skilled with the chisel. Every inch of skin seemed to be scarred. The mouth looked like a diagonal gash, and a large chunk of the nose was missing. But it was the man's eyes that made him frightening. One of them was small, dark, and beady. The other was large, round as a coin in a vivid electric blue. The blue eye was moving ceaselessly, without blinking, and was rolling up, down, and from side to side, quite independently of the normal eye, and then it rolled right over, pointing into the back of the man's head so that all they could see was whiteness. The stranger reached Dumbledore. He stretched out a hand that was as badly scarred as his face, and Dumbledore shook it, muttering words Harry couldn't hear. He seemed to be making some inquiry of the stranger, who shook his head unsmilingly and replied in an undertone. Dumbledore nodded and gestured the man to the empty seat at his right-hand side. The stranger sat down, shook his mane of dark grey hair out of his face, pulled a plate of sausages toward him, raised it to what was left of his nose, and sniffed it. He then took a small knife out of his pocket, speared a sausage on the end of it, and began to eat. His normal eye was fixed upon the sausages, but the blue eye was still darting relentlessly around in its socket, ticking in the hall on the students. "May I introduce our new defense against the dark arts teacher," said Dumbledore brightly into the silence. "Professor Moody." More on Mad-Eye Moody, as Angela says in the chat here. Mad-Eye Moody, he knows how to make an entrance. I love how beautifully written this is. This is, I think, in part because it is representative of Harry's perspective on Hogwarts and is kind of laden, is burdened with that sense of adolescent ennui. I've lost my sense of Hogwarts as a magical place. Even the description that we get of the Great Hall is lacking in wonder, is lacking in awe, as it should be, because we're in Harry's POV for those sequences. But here we are reminded, forcibly and violently reminded, that when Rowling wants to, she can pull out the awe. She can absolutely communicate a striking physical presence and do so beautifully, do so imaginatively. I love the line. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what human faces are supposed to look like and was none too skilled with a chisel. None too skilled with a chisel is a beautiful cap on that original thought, which is itself very impressive. I love the way that this is written. I love the attention to detail. I love the focus that we get on Mad-Eye Moody here. He is clearly supposed to be an enigmatic figure. He is a figure who is challenging, a figure who is difficult, right? It's difficult to integrate Mad-Eye Moody into our understanding of the world. Is he good looking and therefore virtuous and well-intentioned? Or is he, ugly and therefore evil? Well, the world, it turns out, does not work that way. Though it has previously a little bit, it has previously, but much less so now, right? Now we're moving into a much more complex moral world. Let's push ahead to the end of the chapter entitled The Triwizard Tournament so that we get a chance to talk about the Triwizard Tournament, you guys. The Triwizard Tournament was first established some 700 years ago as a friendly competition between the three largest European schools of wizardry, Hogwarts, Beauxbaton, and Durmstrang. A champion was selected to represent each school, and the three champions competed in three magical tasks. The schools took it in turns to host the tournament once every 5 years, and it was generally agreed to be a most excellent way of establishing ties between young witches and wizards of different nationalities. Until, that is, the death toll mounted so high that the tournament was discontinued. Death toll, Hermione whispered, looking alarmed, but her anxiety did not seem to be shared by the majority of students in the hall. Many of them were whispering excitedly to one another, and Harry himself was far more interested in hearing about the tournament than in worrying about deaths that had happened hundreds of years ago. There have been several attempts over the centuries to reinstate the tournament, Dumbledore continued, none of which has been very successful. However, our own departments of international magical cooperation and magical games and sports have decided the time is ripe for another attempt. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that this time no champion will find himself or herself in mortal danger. The heads of Beauxbaton and Durmstrang will be arriving here with their shortlisted contenders in October, and the selection of the three champions will take place at Halloween. An impartial judge will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. The 1,000 galleons, as we discussed last time, approximately $25,000 in today's money, according to the best reckoning that we can make of the unfathomable economics of J.K. Rowling's wizarding world. Yeah, Spatula McGrady speaking for a lot of us here. Moments like these, I hate that Richard Harris didn't get to play out these beautiful Dumbledore scenes in Goblet and Phoenix. I know that... Michael Gambon is just giving a very different performance. It's a much less Dumbledorian performance. It's you know what? In general, I think a less impressive performance. I'm infinitely saddened that we didn't get Richard Harris in Goblet of Fire in particular, in Goblet of Fire and in Order of the Phoenix in particular. Right? There are great Dumbledore moments in these books, which I wish we could have brought to life with all of that gravitas, all of that irrepressible charm and joy that Harris took to that role. Just gorgeously done. Yes, I wish that we had those things too. So a couple of minor points here. The Triwizard Tournament, this interscholastic competition between, crucially, the three largest European schools of wizardry. Not the only three wizarding schools in Europe. By definition, not the only three wizarding schools in Europe. There must be at least one other wizard school in Europe. We can be sure of that because otherwise the word largest would be unnecessary, right? The three largest wizarding schools in Europe. Hogwarts, Beauxbaton, and Durmstrang. I do like the idea that the Triwizard Tournament actually accomplished its goal for its duration, right? That we were just talking about the rumors that have been spread about Durmstrang and the fact that no one even knows where it is, this secrecy that has enveloped the other European magical schools. I like the idea that separation between these three wizarding institutions has developed in the years since the Triwizard Tournament ended. I like very much the idea that the Triwizard Tournament was completely successful in its goal of fostering closer relations and ties between these three schools. And while it may seem oddly counterintuitive to foster closer ties between three institutions by pitting champions against each other for school glory and an actual cash prize and a cup and all of this wonderful stuff, I don't think that's counterintuitive at all. In fact, I think that particularly through the selection of champions, that there is actually an established precedent for that in the real world. I'll put it that way. But let's not put our students in danger, observes Spatula McGrady. Yes, I think, it's pretty bad. Carmine points out, I always figured there had to be at least a German wizarding school. The Germans like their academia. I like very much the idea that there are 4 wizarding schools in Europe. Actually, I like the idea that there's just the underdog wizarding school in Europe. Yeah, probably in Germany, maybe in Spain. I don't know. But, maybe gosh, where would be the best? No, like Austria, right? You want like the peaks of Austria, like in that Germanic tradition, but not actually, or maybe deep in the Black Forest, kind of speaking to that fairy tale tradition. Yes, some little sequestered underdog school that's like, well, no Triwizard Cup this year. I guess we'll just hang out and do good work. I suppose that's what we'll do. We'll just be here teaching the kids, teaching the next generation of wizards. I mean, no big deal that we didn't get invited again for the 1,000th year running. Thanks, you guys. The introduction of the death toll, of course, is brilliant and is going to set the stage for what we get from the Triwizard Cup. Ultimately, I've spoken before, and again, we're not there yet, but we will get there in a few chapters' time. I will talk at length when we actually introduce the mechanics of the Triwizard Cup, the Triwizard Tournament, rather. When we get there, I will talk about the Triwizard Tournament as the fullest realization of the kind of interscholastic competitions that we have seen, or intrascholastic competitions that we have seen previously, right? This is the logical extension of the British boarding school adventure interscholastic competition. This is the logical extension of the Hogwarts Quidditch Cup, of even the notion of house points at all, right? This is the logical extension. We are advancing and accelerating and raising the stakes here throughout the competition, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But it's very much in that tradition, and while acknowledging that it makes, I want to be very careful here. While acknowledging that it challenges our understanding of the actual mechanics of the wizarding world that J.K. Rowling presents to us, it does work metaphorically beautifully. It is exactly what it is supposed to be. It is lunacy, but it's a kind of intentional authorial lunacy that I really enjoy. Yeah, good. Okay, let's get to, Becca says, can I go to Andorian magic school? A tiny magical community would make so much sense for that country. That'd be really good. Yeah, good. Special McGrady quoting, want to play Quidditch? Yeah, I guess. I mean, does it matter? Does it matter if we play Quidditch? Does it matter what we do here at our tiny no marks magic school somewhere lost in Central Europe? Yeah, okay. So that's the Triwizard Tournament. We get the introduction of Beauxbaton of Durmstrang, the formalization of Beauxbaton of Durmstrang. We're looking ahead to Halloween. We're looking ahead to the impartial judge for whom this novel is named. All of that will come up in the chapters to come. Okay, 3 more slides for Chapter 13. Chapter 13, Mad-Eye Moody, most of which we're not going to discuss, because most of which is preoccupied with the mechanics of day-to-day life at Hogwarts. We're going to spend some time with Madame Pomfrey, and then we're going to spend some time with Professor Trelawney, and then we're going to spend some time with Hagrid, and we're just going to kind of go through the motions of a school day at Hogwarts. So we begin with this. The storm had blown itself out the following morning, though the ceiling in the Great Hall was still gloomy. Heavy clouds of pewter grey swirled overhead as Harry, Ron, and Hermione examined their new course schedules at breakfast. A few seats along, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan were discussing magical methods of aging themselves and bluffing their way into the Triwizard Tournament. Today's not bad. Outside all morning, said Ron, who was running his finger down the Monday column of his schedule. Herbology with the Hufflepuffs and Care Magical Creatures. Damn it, we're still with the Slytherins. Double divination this afternoon, Harry groaned, looking down. Divination was his least favorite subject, apart from potions. Professor Trelawney kept predicting Harry's death, which he found extremely annoying. You should have just given it up like me, shouldn't you? Said Hermione briskly, buttering herself some toast. Then you'd be doing something sensible like arithmancy. You're reading again, I notice, said Ron, watching Hermione, adding liberal amounts of jam to her toast, too. I've decided that there are better ways of making a stand about elf rights, said Hermione haughtily. Yeah, and you were hungry, said Ron, grinning. Another example of Hermione's unsupportable position, I suppose. The aspect of Hermione's argument which is neither philosophical nor political, but is untutored, which is about adolescent rebellion. It is not about the actual practical consequence or the actual practical principle underpinning that act of rebellion, right? Hermione has decided that she is going to take action, but it is not going to be a direct action, and that's not an unwise place for her to be, right? That's not an unwise approach for Hermione. We're going to kind of sketch this through the course of this chapter, where she keeps eating quickly and running off to the library, even though it's the first day. That's not an unwise or unpragmatic position for Hermione. That's actually a pretty smart approach to this entire situation. Hermione recognizing, hey, what is the most efficient way of solving this problem? Well, it isn't starving myself. it's actually affecting real social change, right? Good job, Hermione. That's very smart. But in the narrative lens, from the perspective of the narrative that we are presented with, we are supposed to look at Hermione's principle with a certain ironic detachment, a certain ironic criticism here. We're getting this undercutting from Ron. Yeah, and you were hungry, said Ron, grinning, kind of tying back again to the notion that the Harry Potter books have a weird relationship with food, is what it comes down to, right? More often than not. I mean, food can be tremendously celebratory. Food can be wondrous. We have these magnificent feasts in the Great Hall, and people eat copiously and eat, gluttonously in the course of these wonderful, wonderful festival celebratory meals. But we just saw in the last chapter how Ron is made a figure of fun, a figure of ridicule, because he is so gluttonous in that moment, right? We get the first beat where his mouth is full of mashed potato, and then he's spewing bits of Yorkshire pudding everywhere. And we're invited, I think, to be somewhat dismissive of Ron in that moment. And here, Hermione, too, buttering the toast, adding liberal amounts of jam to her toast, right? There's a sense here, too. Yeah, and you were hungry, said Ron, grinning. You were hungry. That makes you abandon your principles, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, there's a practical element to consider here. Again, more on this as we move forward. Yes, good. Okay. So then we get our introduction to the new school year. As I say, we visit with Madame Pomfrey, we visit with Hagrid, we visit with Professor Trelawney. We get a weirdly off-color joke between Ron and Lavender Brown about Ron wanting to take a look at Lavender's Uranus. I mean, not off color in the I am scandalized by this joke, how dare you, or even off color in the well, this is untrue of teenagers. In my experience, this is 100% true of teenagers. It's a very consistent joke, but it's an odd joke within the context of the Harry Potter series, right? We've had a reference to Hermione's knickers and this off-color joke from Ron in the context of the first third of this novel, the first quarter of this novel even. And that shows that we are, continuing the progression toward a dubious kind of maturity, I suppose. We're continuing to move toward, he's 14, points out Ryan. Yes, like I completely buy it from Ron. It feels very true to me for Ron in that instance. It's odd in that it would not have fit back in Prisoner of Azkaban or in one of the earlier books. We are acknowledging that these characters are getting older and they're beginning to kind of interact in this slightly more playful way in terms of Ron, and this slightly more aggressive and threatening way in terms of Draco Malfoy. That's pretty much where we are. Yeah, good. Okay. Let's look at the return of Draco Malfoy here toward the end of the chapter. As I say, we're skipping over most of this chapter because it's just, hey, school at Hogwarts. It's that thing that we do. And it's kind of gross and it's kind of unpleasant and it's kind of burdensome, which is perhaps surprising, but it's settling in again. We're drawing breath now again before we catch up with the unforgivable curses next week. This is the article from the Daily Prophet. Further mistakes at the Ministry of Magic. It seems as though the Ministry of Magic's troubles are not yet at an end, writes Rita Skeeter, special correspondent. Recently under fire for its poor crowd control at the Quidditch World Cup and still unable to account for the disappearance of one of its witches, the Ministry was plunged into fresh embarrassment yesterday by the antics of Arnold Weasley of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. Malfoy looked up. Imagine them not even getting his name right, Weasley. It's almost as though he's a complete non-entity, isn't it? He crowed. Everyone in the entrance hall was listening now. Malfoy straightened the paper with a flourish and read on. Arnold Weasley, who was charged with possession of a flying car 2 years ago, was yesterday involved in a tussle with several Muggle lawkeepers, policemen, over a number of highly aggressive dustbins. Mr. Weasley appeared to have rushed to the aid of Mad-Eye Moody, the aged ex-Auror who retired from the ministry when no longer able to tell the difference between a handshake and attempted murder. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Weasley found upon arrival at Mr. Moody's heavily guarded house that Mr. Moody had once again raised a false alarm. Mr. Weasley was forced to modify several memories before he could escape from the policeman, but refused to answer Daily Prophet questions about why he had involved the ministry in such an undignified and potentially embarrassing scene. We already know Rita Skeeter is the worst. We already know that the Daily Prophet is the worst. Hey, stick around for lots more of that in the rest of the Harry Potter series. What we're doing here, though, is continuing to in some senses, I think, elevate Mad-Eye Moody's profile here in Hogwarts. We already had the introduction in the last chapter, right? When Amos Diggory gets in touch with Arthur and sends him off on his quest to go and help, saying that Mad-Eye Moody is in trouble. But here we're getting the assault upon his character. He was forced to retire from the ministry when no longer able to tell the difference between a handshake and attempted murder. This paranoid fool of an ex-Auror, right? This person who was once in the vanguard of the fight against dark wizardry in all its forms, now has slipped into paranoia. And if you want to defeat your enemy, you must at first discredit them. That seems to be where we are right now. And that's purposeful within the frame of the text, you understand? Because we are not supposed to be... Okay, how can I put this? We as readers are not sympathetic toward the Daily Prophet at this point. We are not inclined to believe anything that is written in the Daily Prophet. We are, in fact, disinclined to believe anything that is written in the Daily Prophet. We are particularly disinclined to believe anything that is written by Rita Skeeter within the Daily Prophet. We are doubly, triply, quadruply disinclined to believe anything that is written in the Daily Prophet and flourished by one Draco Malfoy. The fact that this article is undermining Mad-Eye Moody seems in effect to support Mad-Eye Moody and to bolster his position. He is now under assault from forces of which we are rightly suspicious at this point. Let's get to our final slide for today's session. Hey, look at that. I made it through 3 chapters. Can you believe it? Oh, no, you don't, laddie. Harry spun around. Professor Moody was limping down the marble staircase. His wand was out and it was pointing right at a pure white ferret, which was shivering on the stone-flagged floor, exactly where Malfoy had been standing. There was a terrified silence in the entrance hall. Nobody but Moody was moving a muscle. Moody turned to look at Harry. At least his normal eye was looking at Harry. The other was pointing into the back of his head. Did he get you? Moody growled. His voice was low and gravelly. No, said Harry. Missed. Leave it! Moody shouted. Leave what? Harry said, bewildered. Not you, him, Moody growled, jerking his thumb over his shoulder at Crabbe, who had just frozen, about to pick up the white ferret. It seemed that Moody's rolling eye was magical and could see out of the back of his head. Moody started to limp toward Crabbe, Goyle, and the ferret, which gave a terrified squeak and took off, streaking toward the dungeons. I don't think so, roared Moody, pointing his wand at the ferret again. It flew 10 feet into the air, fell with a smack to the floor, and then bounced upward once more. I don't like people who attack when their opponent's back's turned, growled Moody as the ferret bounced higher and higher, squealing in pain. Stinking, cowardly, scummy thing to do. This is the introduction of Mad-Eye Moody. This is when it really matters. And of course, he is siding with Harry against Draco Malfoy and making it clear why he is siding with Harry against Draco Malfoy. I don't like people who attack when their opponent's backs turned, growled Moody as the ferret bounced higher and higher, squealing in pain. Stinking, cowardly, scummy thing to do. Becca's observing that my Mad-Eye is kind of terrifying. I think he's supposed to be terrifying right now. I think he's supposed to be utterly intimidating. He just turned a student into a ferret and then bounced it around the room. That seems to me to be somewhat out of character for even the professors at Hogwarts, even professors of the dark arts at Hogwarts. This is a hard line. And though he is allying himself is too strong, though he is aligning himself with Harry at this point, that does not mean that he is yet worthy of our trust. And here we're seeing what is a functional echo, I suppose, of Sirius Black in Prisoner of Azkaban. Here's a character who is well-intentioned, but rough. He is rough around the edges because of what he has suffered. And there does seem to be a certain connection, a certain symmetry here between Sirius Black in Prisoner of Azkaban and Sirius Black on an ongoing basis, let's be honest, and Mad-Eye Moody. They are both wizards who have been wounded and have suffered for that, I suppose. Again, what is the notion? What is the nature of Mad-Eye Moody's identity at this point? That may lead us to question exactly how we are supposed to account for this, but it doesn't seem to be out of character with Moody in general, right? Taking stark and decisive action based on principle seems to be completely consistent with what we'll see from Mad-Eye Moody later. Yeah. Let me see. Becca says, stop being mean to ferrets, just be mean to normal Draco, right? We're just humiliating him by turning him into a ferret here also. It just seems unnecessary. Yes, yes. Karen observes, not only is this an awesomely satisfying scene, but it's a remarkably subtle bit of double-crossing of us, the audience, by JKR. Yes, I like that very much. I like that very much. I love the way it's written. I love Mad-Eye Moody works great. The reason originally that I wanted to cover the Triwizard Tournament and Mad-Eye Moody and the Unforgivable Curses in one session is that it gives us, you know, the distant introduction, then the personal introduction, and then the kind of grander introduction to this character. We've fallen out of our rhythm here, which is actually perfectly fine because there's no way we would have covered those 3 chapters in the time allotted to us. But yes, good. Okay. Carmine says, I keep revisiting these Mad-Eye scenes with the knowledge of what happens to his character later on. I'm wondering about Dumbledore's opinions and suspicions of all that. Yeah, we might have to just flutter our hands at that. We might just have to let that go, at least until the end of the book, when we can talk more freely about it and certainly get into Dumbledore's motivations there. But yes, I think you're onto something there. Yes, and of course, C-Star observed the minor spoiler. His professed hatred of the Malfoys may be true to both Moody and, quote, Moody. Yes. Absolutely fair. In fact, absolutely fair. All right, that I think is going to do it. Those are our slides. Let's take a quick look at next week's session. Next week's session, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, chapters 12 to 14. No, I didn't update this. This is actually incorrect. I did update it on my personal list here. Let me take down that slide. That's the wrong slide. Next week, chapters 14 to 16, The Unforgivable Curses, Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, and the Goblet of Fire. Next week, at pretty much the halfway point of this book, we get into it. It actually really kicks off next week. That is going to be at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, February 6th, 2018. An evening session next week. I know that I originally said that this was going to be an evening session too, but this week is crazy and riotous, so we're pulling as many of these things into the afternoon as we possibly can. Let's take a quick look at the questions box. I have like 5 minutes. Yeah, Karen's saying here in the Crowdcast chat, we may need a special extra session after Goblet of Fire ends to discuss Moody. Yes, I think so. I think that might be necessary. Though also, I think as part of our discussion of the movie, we can kind of get into some of that too. I do want to, I've done this before with mixed success. I do want to, I think, try to take maybe just the very last chapter of this book on its own in the final session, and then open up a space for extended Q&A and extended discussion. And of course, some of these deeper conversations we can have over on the Point North Media forum at pointnorthmedia.com/forum. That's a great space for delving into some of those intricacies, for delving into some of the deeper issues here. Yeah, good. Okay, let me see. Why did, well, Angela has an unanswerable question here. Why did Dumbledore revitalize/plan the Triwizard Tournament? What was his purpose/agenda? Connect and forge international alliances against the rise of Voldemort, test or feel out the alliances of the other wizarding schools, test and challenge and pick the new generation of fighters? All of the above? All of the above, I would argue, yes. I don't think that we can comprehensively answer that. Well, I don't think we're going to be able to comprehensively answer that definitively by the end of this book. But I do think that we will have more information that we can use to answer that question toward the end of the book. And of course, the alliance of the Ministry on this subject, at this point in the narrative, I don't think I'm looking too far ahead. At this point in the narrative, I think we might be inclined to see a connection between the Triwizard Tournament and the Quidditch World Cup, right? That these two very public events, and we know that the Triwizard Tournament, for all that it's an interscholastic competition, is appealing to people beyond the bounds of Hogwarts because, you know, Bill and Charlie want to be there. Wizards from all over the country presumably want to be there, want to take part in the festivities surrounding the return of the Triwizard Tournament. This is bread and circuses, I think, in part. This is the Ministry's desire to combat a rising darkness with distraction. This is what we're doing in part through the course of this book. And I think that we are cued to see that. We're cued to understand that even at this point in the narrative, yeah. But as for Dumbledore's personal engagement, again, we'll talk about Moody at the end of the book, and we'll definitely talk about Dumbledore at the end of the book too. And then again, much later. Yes, Angela says, I love posing unanswerable questions, as you so often do. Yes. Let me see here. Did Dumbledore somehow know or want Harry to be in the Triwizard? Well, okay, nope. I'm not going to answer that one because we'll be talking about that when we get there. Angela, you can't trick me. You can't get me to talk about chapters that we haven't yet discussed. You absolutely can. It's quite trivial even, but I'm not going to do it right now. A question from Spatula McGrady. Taking extra textual information out of the discussion, the fact that house elves are signified as a particular type of elf, are they then an evolution and a domesticated form of what was potentially a much more pure and pre-human creature? You're right. You're right. House seems to be a modifier. House elf, as distinct from wild elf, perhaps. That does seem to be implicit in the name. Yes, taking extra-textual information out, and kind of, when we say extra-textual information in this regard, I don't even necessarily just want to separate out what Pottermore and the Harry Potter wiki and what J.K. Rowling herself tells us about house elves. I also maybe want to separate Harry Potter from the rest of fantasy literature and from the rest of, you know, the fairy tale tradition going back to the medieval period in Western Europe, kind of distinguish this text, take this text on its own terms. Yes, I think the division between domesticated and wild forms of elves is implied by the use of the term house elf. Otherwise, we would presumably just call them elves, right? Does that mean that they are more suited to the task? Does that mean that the moral complication is different? Well, what really matters there is the degree to which we are acknowledging or denying the sapience of elves here, the degree to which we are recognizing the personhood. Okay, lowercase h humanity of non-human creatures, to what degree we are respectful of non-human creatures. It is a very complicated issue within this text, even without looking outside to extra-textual sources like real-world politics or real-world history, right? If we just come into this and this is our first instance of if slavery is a made-up magical word, right? If slavery is like unto Quidditch, that in the real world we had never encountered this kind of thing, what would the morality of Goblet of Fire look like? Well, I think it would look pretty much the same, right? This is kind of an adolescent perspective on, and by adolescent, I don't want to fall into that trap of making adolescent a dirty word, right? I don't want to fall into the trap of using adolescence as a flat and obvious criticism of what these characters are doing or feeling or going through. When I say adolescent, I simply mean fierce but unsophisticated. That to me is the defining characteristic of adolescent rebellion in particular, adolescent political rebellion, doubly particular. That to me seems to be very true of Hermione's response here. And I'm not sure exactly what we make of the House Elves in that regard, but I don't think it's terribly different from the kind of finished, polished, final version that we come to by reintegrating this book with its context. I think we're kind of getting to the same. Fierce but unsophisticated can be my band name, says Carmine in the chat. Yes, good. All right, you guys, that is actually going to do it. I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up right there and give no more thought to House Elves for now. We will return next week, as I say, chapters 14 to 16, the Unforgivable Curses, Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, and the Goblet of Fire. We will get right to it next week at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, February the 6th, 2018. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you will all be able to join me again next week. Until then, you can find me over at the forum, pointnorthmedia.com/forum. If you have thoughts about Harry Potter, you can email me directly, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, mischief managed.